is the October 12th, 2022 BPW Finance Committee meeting. Welcome to everyone who is here and in the ether. Mike, are you there?
I am. Can you see me and hear me?
I think so. You're showing up. Muted, unmuted.
Can
Can you hear us?
No, I was
I
gonna
can
say
hear you.
that the speaker's working, but
Well,
you
this is it. Those are the Scarlets.
Can you hear me now?
no.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Technical difficulties.
Maybe you just didn't have anything to say there.
No, he probably is talking. We just can't hear him. Switch it to the Sam's. And now try it.
Mike, are you there?
I am.
Here we go.
Okay.
Back to IT. Back to IT.
Can you hear and see me?
We can hear you.
Not see you.
Okay. I can see you and hear you both.
Okay, we're working on improving the sound and definitely we would love to see you. But
Okay.
we can see your name in large font. So
Okay.
that counts as your being here. So we have 5 members of our committee here. Tom Owen and Jack Lesher are not here and were unable to join by Zoom. So we do have a quorum. And I will ask to see if there are any revisions or deletions to the agenda. Item number 3. Hearing none, I will go to 4, approval of the July 29, 2022 Finance Committee minutes as amended.
Richard, I have one suggestion. You mentioned I did send some amendments to Sharon, but there's an awful lot of acronyms in those minutes. For those of us that are not steeped in the utility industry, it can be hard to kind of plow through them. I don't know if there's a way to put like or at least the first time an acronym shows up, maybe put the actual words around what it means or what it is.
Okay,
Yep, we can do that.
That's
Good
the way to do it
suggestion.
anyway.
thank you. Hearing no further comments,
Need a motion.
we do,
Mhm.
okay. May I have a motion to accept the July 29, 2022 Finance Committee meetings minutes?
Sure, I make a motion to accept the July 2022 minutes, not the other one.
Do I hear a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 All opposed? Motion carries. Item 5, discussion of nominations for the 2 open Finance Committee seats. I have not heard any chatter or suggestions, but we are still open to having 1 or 2 people join. Hopefully part of their,
Is anybody actively working on finding people? Or is it what?
I think we're trying to think of people who might have financial background of some sort, as opposed to just somebody who might be interested in being on a committee.
Correct. Amen on that one.
I did reach out to a finance professional that has a house in Lewes, but he's got a full-time job and small kids and another nonprofit he's involved with. So he said he would think about it, but it sounded very doubtful to me after I spoke with him that he'd be willing to commit the time.
Is it possible that if one of us reached out to him to discuss it. That would,
Possibly, I'd like to maybe I'd want to entertain that with him first.
Okay.
See what, see
Yeah.
what his thoughts are. He was being polite with me, but not, definitely
Right.
not.
okay. Well, maybe he knows someone who knows someone.
It's all about who you know. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, we're easy here. And he can know somebody who knows somebody else with it.
Do you all know Ray Book? He has Book and Associates, the accounting firm in Lewes.
I don't think I know.
Where is the firm?
It's in Lewes.
Well, his main headquarters, I think, is in Dover, but he has an office here in Lewes. He's on the finance committee for the Children's Beach House. I actually hadn't thought about him until we just started talking here. I don't know where, his thoughts would be. He's an accountant, or he has an tax accounting firm. I could ask him if he would have any interest.
Worth a try.
Just hold it. There.
You got him turned off then.
We're still trying to get your sound right.
There you
There you go.
You see much closer now. Yes, if you could pursue that, that would be great.
It's on.
Or link us in, one of us in somehow to participate, or it would be helpful not to be so close to the edge of having a quorum. Because
Yeah.
people who have other things, other meetings and so on. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Number 6, discussion of the 10-year utility capital projects framework. There were 2 attachments, A and a B. As documentation, 6A is the memorializing of the presumptions and information that Austin and Kim put together to enter information for the 10-year revised and updated capital projects. And B is a wider chart. You can put that on the screen. This was a first run at a scenario for water, and happened to have been done for the best case scenario. But it's an example of the formatting and the kind of information that needed to be put together for the scenario analysis. And it's in a form that was convenient and already existed and very helpful for BPW. But Mike Hogan had noted that sometimes when information is spread out, as this is, as part of proof of concept for the scenario analysis, that using a more compressed format would make it easier for regular people to understand and get a grasp visually of what was happening and what insights can be observed. So the next item 7 is to further actions to review and adjust the utility inputs
Mhm.
and to move forward toward financial planning. And I would like to ask Mike if he would take over from here and help us walk further ahead with the scenario and simulation analysis.
Sure. And just to be clear, Richard was kind enough to set up a series of meetings to actually talk more in depth about the framework we were trying to put together. So I definitely don't want to repeat a lot of the discussion that we've already had with everybody, but this was an example of organizing the information in a slightly different way. We also, because there's so many values and numbers here, in order to try to take things in, it's usually easier to have them in one area, and humans tend to read left to right. So
Sorry.
That was,
Yeah, we're just putting up the 7A slide.
no, that is 7.
That is something.
Mhm.
Never mind.
we humans tend to read left to right. So I kind of reorganized the summaries, the first 5 years, the last 5 years, and then the whole time period move them all to the right.
Mhm. Yeah.
This spreadsheet and tabular analysis is a little bit of there's an art to it, which means that not everybody might like it. So if people have other ways they want to have data presented, by all means, but this type of format that we're showing here is similar to the types of tabular organization that I would have worked with over my career. When you're looking at this kind of data, no matter what, tabular data is a lot of data, and it just is what it is. But the other reason for doing this was not just readability, but it was also it's a little bit easier to build the model that we were using with the data formatted in this way. And in particular, we were focused on row 45, which is the net cash flow for each individual scenario. I don't know if you guys can see it. I can see 45 on my.
We can.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that I don't have much more to say to this other than if anybody, has any other suggestions or things like that they'd like to see in an organizational tabular organization,
Refresh my
Would be great
memory.
to
How
talk
was
about
it tabulated before? This is,
This is the scenario analysis
okay, but it's, oh, I see, versus the way you did it
versus
before.
the next.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah.
I got you. Yeah, this is much easier. Reading left to right. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
Okay. Can we can keep going.
Yeah.
So
Kim, those original tabular files, was that an organization that came out of a particular system? In other words, it is what it is, or was that something where there was some flexibility in its organization?
Can you ask that again a different way?
Oh, sorry. Well, a lot of providers, for example, use QuickBooks to show, financial information of their organization. They sort of have a standard format that just pops out. It just is what it is. So I wasn't sure if that original spreadsheet that you showed was from a kind of a standardized format out of a piece of software, or whether it's just an organizational
Yeah, that's just from
table you
Excel.
put together. Okay, so there would be flexibility then.
Yes.
It wouldn't be painful to move to this modified format, I guess.
Correct.
Okay, all right, thank you. Yeah. Well, anyway, just to kind of move along here, Kim and Austin put together 4 scenarios for 3 different utilities. And as I said on that previous page that Richard was showing, we were kind of focused on the net cash flow from each one of the scenarios. So in a sense, it's sort of like line 45, which we just saw in a previous table for each scenario. And so this table here kind of sums up all the scenario work, but in a way that we can use it in our little Monte Carlo model. The other important thing is all the way to the right are the probabilities that Kim and Austin had put to each scenario. Unfortunately, the left-hand side that says breakpoint, which is third column to the left, I actually needed that for a particular Excel function. It's a modification of that probability line. I don't want people to get hung up on the breakpoint, but somebody specifically asked me about that row or about that column. It's really a functional column.
So the probability is the one you want to keep.
The probability is the one that we're going to talk about, and it's important. The breakpoint was a modification I had to do in that to get one of the Excel functions to work appropriately.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Okay, Richard, unless anybody has any questions, I don't really have anything else to.
Well,
Oh, I'm sorry, Richard. Could you go back to that for just a moment? I apologize.
what we also, when we had this scenario analysis in our last episode, we were going to work on present value as a next step. And you, in your better understanding of BPW's utilities and information, thought that switching or adding a simulation analysis would be more helpful as a tool. And so that's what produced 7C. Is that?
Yes, everything gets back to two questions that or two powerful comments that Austin mentioned the first meeting that I was in. The one was how difficult it is to forecast the future, which anybody that's ever tried to do that understands. And the second was, we had this investment portfolio. Is it big enough to cover our expenses? And while most people recognize the difficulty of forecasting the future, a lot of people tend to ignore that difficulty in the end, and they sort of produce a number and they say, here's our number. It turns out that there's a lot of interesting information that's actually in the uncertainty itself. And so thinking about how uncertain the numbers are and how wide they can vary is as important when forecasting as it is coming up with sort of this is our best guess. And so by taking a scenario analysis approach and combining it with a simulation, what we're really doing is not ignoring the uncertainty, the difficulty of forecasting the future. We're trying to embrace it and understand that it's a part of trying to navigate an uncertain future and trying to get us a sense for the scale and perhaps overall how we can actually reduce perhaps some of that uncertainty, or at least make it more likely that we'll have a good outcome in the future than a bad outcome. So if you've never done scenario analysis before, it might seem a little bit, why are we wasting our time on this? And I've not gotten that feeling from anybody in the committee. So I'm just making a general comment here.
Well, the accuracy is better.
What's that?
It makes it's more accurate.
Well, what it really does is it says, there's this old, I might have said this to somebody, there's this old, in statistics, this notion of a drunk trying to walk down the double yellow line of a road, weaving back and forth. On average, they stay on the yellow line and everything's fine, but they actually get killed in the weaving off the line. In a sense, it's, the statistical analogy here is you can say, this is my best guess, this is my yellow line for the next 5 or 10 years, and we'll be fine if we stay on the yellow line. But it gives you no sense for how much weaving you're doing. And whether you're going to run out of money long before you ever get to the end. So in effect, what we're trying to do here is to say what we're trying to forecast in the future is not our best case or our average, case. We're trying to forecast or characterize a distribution of uncertainty, which has in its characterization a middle ground, a best case, but it also has a lot of other stuff, both good and bad in it. And there's information in that and understanding that. To maybe use an analogy from Lewes, on average, the weather in September is really nice. And if we were forecasting out the weather in September for the next 10 years, it's probably not that hard for the average. But what we're really worried about is not the average temperature and the average weather in September. We're worried about the hurricane weather. And so you don't want to ignore that. You want to try to understand that and prepare for it and embrace it. And so the scenario analysis is trying to it's trying to help us think about where the middle is, but maybe more importantly, it's trying to make us understand where the extremes are that could really get the organization into trouble. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Okay. I don't want to get lost. I don't want this. I don't want to overemphasize this, but I don't want to get lost in the shuffle. All the future is always uncertain, and you have to characterize that uncertainty. It's just as important. So the scenario analysis was our first big step in going down that path. Over time, Kim and Austin may evolve and tweak these numbers, and as we get more information, things may get clearer either on the upside or downside, and we should continue to take that information into account. But we should never ignore the uncertainty in our numbers. We should include that in our analysis. So enough said. Now, what I wanted to just say with this is when we're running our simulations, Kim had made a comment to me, an important comment. I'd asked, back to the other page, Richard or Sharon,
Okay.
who's ever running the, I asked Kim a couple weeks ago if these scenarios are independent of each other or are dependent on each other. In other words, if maybe it's a hurricane that makes the worst case scenario of each of these, in which case the hurricane would make us have a worst case water utility, a worst case stormwater utility, and a worst case electric utility all happen at the same time. That would be kind of an example of a dependent set of scenarios. On the other hand, if they're largely independent of each other, the different scenarios may have to do with, I don't know, the amount of building that's going on in Lewes versus storms versus taxes versus, government regulation and on and on and on. It may be that, and those things all impact each of these utilities differently. It may be that these different scenarios are actually independent of each other. In other words, you're just as likely to get a best case water utility and a worst case electric utility as you are to get a worst case water utility and a worst case electric utility. So that would be an example of an independent set of scenarios. Kim said, and Kim, if I'm mischaracterizing, please jump in here, but Kim said she felt that for the most part, the scenarios were independent of each other. So a little bit more random.
Correct.
And that's the way we actually modeled our simulations, that these were independent events. So that would mean in practice, in a simulation, we have to create what are called, what I easily, or simply call trials. So one trial might be, well, first off, if we only had one utility, we only have 4 possible cases. If we have 2 utilities and each one of them has 4 different possibilities, like we're showing here, then we no longer have 4 possibilities, we have 16 possibilities. And if we had 3 scenarios, each with 4 possibilities and each independent of each other, there's actually 64 different combinations of these scenarios that we could have. You know, you could have a best in water utility and a best in stormwater utility and a worst in electric utility, and that would be one combination. Well, there's 64 of those. When Kim and Austin add a 4th utility, we're now going to have 256 different possible combinations. The other important thing here is within each utility, Kim didn't weight these 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%. She actually has different weightings for each one of these scenarios within a utility, which you can see on the right-hand side. That means that when we're starting to combine these, that actually is information needs to be taken into account as well. That the best water utility scenario only has a 15% probability of happening, whereas the realistic case 1 has a 35% probability of happening. So as we're sort of doing combinations, we have to take those probabilities into account as well, which we did do in the simulations. So I want to stop there and just, does anybody have any questions, or Kim, do you want to maybe correct anything I said wrong?
I think what you said is accurate, that there's different stuff happening in each utility that affects them differently. Of course, there's things that affect them equally, like price increases and inflation, that everything's going to be more expensive to buy. But I just want to point out that we do only have the 3 utilities on here because of how uncertain we are with the sewer, which Austin and I are going to be working on that to do a few different scenarios for sewer. And once we get results and a direction from the study that we're doing, we can narrow it down a lot more accurately.
What is going to use the same scenario?
So I think we're gonna do 2 different sewers
Oh,
and do a 50-50 split and still do the 15,
okay.
35, 30.
Running 2 different scenarios.
Yeah.
And Kim, just to be clear, we can accommodate in the modeling any combination. In other words, you could just say, we're only comfortable giving you 2 scenarios, a really bad one and a good one. Or we can do 10 scenarios. You know, we can accommodate anything in here. There's nothing magic about the 4.
Mhm.
It's whatever you guys add, we can accommodate.
But
You
they
can-
must,
you can
also-
usually do that.
however many number, the percentages must add up to 100%.
That's right. That is the one, that is a binding constraint. Yeah.
Okay.
One other thing I want to point out here that's important, because this could be confusing. These are annual cash flows, net cash flows for each one of these scenarios. But they're cash flows. It's not a portfolio. It's not a summation of a bunch of different years. Each one of these is an individual year cash flow. So it's an economist would call this a flow concept. And I want to compare that to the next page. And if you can move on, Richard, thank you. This is the first time that we're actually moving from a flow to a cash balance. And if you look at the top of that, right above line, right above the years up there, it says cash balance. So we start off with, on 2022, the size of the cash reserve portfolio, which is $6.5 million. And then we add or subtract to that.
Doesn't include all cash
It's including all UBS,
and operations.
not operations.
Okay.
Mike,
Yes.
Kim and Austin were just clarifying the 6.5 million number. That obviously does not include the sewer and treatment plant.
So this is not a real number in terms?
That
of your-
cash is
value?
real, but this percentages is just accounting for those three utilities,
It's not including sewer.
not including sewer.
Oh, I see.
Right.
To make sure I understand it, that 6.5 million will also have to cover, there isn't an extra pool of money somewhere that's gonna have to
Correct.
cover all four.
That's all it
utilities.
is.
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
But this is proof of concept of,
yeah,
you know, what would happen if you change the 6.5 to 5.5 or
Right,
8.
right.
It's still with this just 5 to 9. Still excludes the sewer,
Yes.
Yeah, the only thing constant is your
Right.
initial value.
but you have the ability to change that 2022
Mhm.
$1 million number to anything that you wanted that might be insightful or helpful to start playing around with how much that number needs to be or could be to get a better flavor of options.
yeah. In fact, if you scroll up a little, the other way, the line number 1 there, that's a changeable cell. Also, what the expected return and volatility are, this is again the first time that we're introducing the concept of a portfolio. So this is a proof of concept. So the expected return and volatility are just placeholders, but they would be an expected return on the investment portfolio that UBS is running and a level of volatility. And that information, so what we're doing in this simulation is we're combining the investment portfolio with those scenario cash flows that we showed on the previous page to run our simulations. Next week, I'm gonna have a conversation with Kim and Austin about investments, which is gonna be very pointed about lines 2 and 3. But I want to have that conversation before we start to get too much into, this is another one of those complicated financial concepts. And I just want to have that conversation before we start to play around a lot with those numbers. Another important thing here is line 4, which is the borrow rate. I'm assuming, and perhaps wrongly, if anybody has a different view, jump in. But that when we go negative cash flow, in other words, when we deplete the portfolio, we would have to borrow money in order to make up the shortfall, and that borrowing is going to come with an interest rate, and that's what that borrow interest rate is. So
Right, yeah.
if you haven't depleted your portfolio, it's growing at the line number 2 rate. If you have depleted your portfolio, you're borrowing at the line number 4 rate, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. It does. You're borrowing more than you're getting.
And that's a fungible number as well.
That's right. They're all adjustable. If you feel that the borrow rate would be much higher, much lower, or,
Okay.
we come to a different view on the investment portfolio, and UBS may be able to help us out here as well. All those things can be changed in here, and all the numbers would simply update.
Okay.
Kim, I don't know if you had an opportunity to play around at all with the spreadsheet, but the other thing you'll find is this is a live spreadsheet. And when you're dealing with distributions, as opposed to algebra, every time you touch a spreadsheet, because of the distribution with 10,000 simulations, all those simulations will be recalculated, and these numbers will all adjust a little bit. That's what happens when you deal with probabilities. If I increase the simulations from 10,000 sims to 100,000 sims, they would change less. And if we increase them to 1 million sims, they would change even less than that. But they do tweak a little bit even without changing the underlying parameters.
Correct. So what I did is I updated the cash amount to the 6.5, which is actually about 6.39
Yeah,
after September closing. But yeah, and then everything changed, and then I saved it, and then it changed again, and then I had to go in and turn off the formulas for it to stop changing.
Now, when the number, just to be clear, when the numbers change, they change at a very, very small amount. But
Yeah.
effectively what Excel is doing is it's going in and pulling another random 10,000
Yeah.
Numbers from a distribution.
Correct.
So they're always slightly different. For those of you that had stats or remember your had stats and remember them, it's kind of the difference between a sample and a population. What Excel's doing is giving us 10,000 samples from a distribution. So every time you hit a button, it pulls another 10,000 samples. So that's hopefully everybody's at least good with that conceptually. Richard, if you wouldn't mind scrolling down to maybe the chart. So the chart.
Rolling.
Hell job, Richard.
Isn't he good? Yeah.
Just thinks about it.
Just looks at the thing. It moves.
So any of you that have ever looked, again, remember your stats or looked at a distribution, you know that a distribution, is kind of an infinite thing. It's got tails and a center, and it may look like a bell shape. Oftentimes, like in this particular case, they don't look anything like a bell shape.
Right.
But what you typically do with a distribution is you sample, or I'm sorry, you look at different slices of that distribution. So that's exactly what we're doing here. You can kind of think, if you think about this isn't exactly correct, but just conceptually, a normal distribution, the kind of typical bell-shaped distribution.
Mhm.
You could think about every year here, 2003, 2023, 24, 25, overlaying a distribution, let's say like a bell-shaped distribution, vertically on each one of these year lines. And so because we have 10 years on here from 2023 to 2032, there'd be 10 normal distributions or distributions, let's say, that are oriented vertically. The middle of that distribution would be very close to that 50%, that gray bar. The upper tip of that distribution, the one that's so high, so far up the distribution that 95% of the observations are below it, is that dark blue line. And on the other extreme, the point on that distribution where only 5% of the points are below it is that light blue bar. And so these are, technically they're kind of cross-sectional slivers of that distribution. But I think the graph or a chart is a nice way to look at things and maybe just kind of get like an idea, but it's still hard to tell what's the chance of going below zero, basically running out of money. And how uncertain are we? How wide are the potential errors? So if you scroll up a little bit, that table right there coincides with that slide. Those are the actual size of the portfolios for these different scenarios. So for example, in 2023, if we have a super, super good outcome in the scenarios that we're facing, and also because we're including the performance on the investment portfolio, which itself has its own level of volatility and uncertainty, both good and bad, there's a chance that we could hardly draw down the portfolio at all. We go from 6.5 million to 6.4 million. But if next year turns out to be a disaster and we have a lot of bad draws from the scenarios, and perhaps we have a bad outcome in our investment portfolio, there is a chance that we could, be down to $3 million in that investment portfolio at the end of next year. Obviously still in the black in the sense that we still have a portfolio, but we wiped out half the portfolio. And so line 10, I'm actually asking a slightly different question, which is rather than sampling points of the distribution, I'm just saying, what's the chance that we'll be negative? It turns out that in the 10,000 scenarios that we ran the 10,000 trials that we ran using the scenarios that Kim and Austin gave us and the size of the investment portfolio, there's about a 0 chance that we would run out of money next year. But in 2024, again, with all the caveats that this is the information that we have, there's almost a 14% chance we will completely deplete the portfolio by 2024. Now, it turns out that in 2025, if you go back to the scenario page, there was a lot of good scenarios, and that helps pull back. There's only a very small chance that we would be out of money then. In other words, we'd have to borrow in 2024, but in 2025, we would kind of be able to pay back that borrowing, and there's only a very small chance we would run out of money. 26 and 27, 26 is a good year. 27, you'd have to go back and look at the scenarios, and perhaps we should, but it turns out that the possibility of underperform or blowing through the whole portfolio rises dramatically, almost 25% chance. And so it's not for me to say whether these are good or bad numbers. All these are a characterization of information that Austin and Kim have submitted. And it's up for the board and the organization to decide whether these are acceptable possibilities or not. If they're not acceptable, then you start the next phase of this, which is financial planning. What can you do to lower those probabilities? Wishful thinking won't do it. And as I said before, if you didn't try to characterize uncertainty, all you did was you said, well, on average, I think we're going to be here. I think the average weather in September is good, so this is what I'm going to focus on. It would be like looking at line number 7 on that table. Every year, we have a nice portfolio that doesn't get depleted. But because we're trying to embrace the uncertainty, the potential for a hurricane in September, and we're trying to make sure that we're not completely caught off guard, we're not just looking at line number 7. We're trying to look at line number 8 and line number 9 and line number 10 as well, because those are the ones that are going to really damage the organization. And it's those that we're trying. This would be even much harder if even our best case or our best guess, our line number 7, if that was all negative, we're really in trouble. That's not the case. But it feels to me like there's probably a high enough probability of some pretty bad scenarios here that the organization might find unacceptable.
And it doesn't include sewer.
Yeah, that's,
And this already includes borrowing that we expect to do on, for example, Cedar Street and the water tower. So this would be in addition to the funding that we're already expected to do.
throw those in and see the numbers.
If I were to take those out, these percentages would be much higher.
So you are if I'm understanding correctly, this is best information accurately of what inflows we have or are expecting by contract or whatever. And so,
Factors in the debt service payment on the debt that would be taken out
right,
to
so
service.
the pluses and minuses are already factored in as far as we know. So question, on 2024 with the 600,000,
628.
628 negative. What is implied?
Does it-
What makes the difference between that negative and 25, the 700 extra? Did 628,000 we borrowed and we've now plugged in the debt service by virtue of the formulas that exist, and that's what gave us the 765 in the following year.
So that's
Yep.
implying that in the simulation, we're making more money than we're spending, which could include borrowing,
Could,
which
but not
I
necessarily.
believe 2025 is a borrowing year.
So if you go back to the scenario page, 7, I think you're calling it 7B, Richard.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
This is actually go to 7B. You're on 7A.
Oh. Okay.
So if you look down 2025,
Right.
what
Big.
really happens is the water utility has
Mhm.
massive positive cash flows
Is
that
that
dwarf the negatives.
2025?
Yeah, water tower. and
The
canal.
water tower has positive before you get to the stormwater. Is that what you're saying? But
Oh, say that again, Carolyn.
in 2025, are you talking about the positiveness of the water utility, and then as you run into stormwater utility in that same year?
That's
Is-
right. So the positive on the water utility is so large in every scenario that
Yeah,
it completely wipes out any shortfall in the other two other two utilities. And it also so large on top of that, it wipes out the shortfall, the worst case shortfall from 2024.
yeah, because it's so, yeah.
We see that again, probably in 2028.
And that's
Mhm,
Cedar.
mhm.
Now, we should talk about this because we can easily modify this, whether we want to start pulling out the individual sources of revenue. In other words, should we embed borrowing within these scenarios, or should we pull it out? Like we did, and have it as a separate factor to close up a gap. The only reason I say that is because that may be one of the levers that you guys use to fill shortfalls.
Yeah, borrow one
Right.
to save the other.
Rob Peter to pay Paul.
Seriously.
Mhm. Yeah, we can do all the different kinds of scenarios. We can do it without any assistance. We can do it without including our O&M revenues, just our portfolio. There's all kinds of different scenarios that we can do and show trends.
Okay, if we
Tim,
go back,
the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think a mistake a lot of organizations do when they think about this stuff is they look too narrowly. I gave you guys an example of an organization I used to work with where they had a massive endowment that was designed to fund that organization.
Mhm.
But about a huge percentage of all their operating income, my mind's escaping me, it's probably like 90% comes from that endowment. So there almost is no other source of income. How that endowment does is how the organization does.
Mhm.
On the other hand, the Children's Beach House also has a large endowment, but that endowment only funds about 10% or 12% of its operating capital. And to get an appropriate picture of those two organizations, the financial situation those two organizations are in, it's not fair just to look at the endowment, because they would both give you different, in other words, it's much, the endowment is much more consequential for one than the other. So I don't know, I'm still trying to get my hands around this organization, but if that cash reserve portfolio accounts for, I'm going to throw out extremes here, 95% of all the funding that's available for these, you probably got some problems. On the other hand, if the cash reserve portfolio only represents 10% of the needed capital to fund these, you probably got a lot more flexibility because you should have a lot of other levers to mess with.
And I'll add the unique aspect is I think we're kind of battling two things. One is you're trying to invest in your existing utilities and kind of finding the threshold between spending your money versus borrowing, but then also utilizing the cash reserve in the thought of fronting your risk behind natural disasters. Because one of them is instead of holding a policy for flood and for pollution, the thought was you self-insure yourself for $1 million as part of your cash reserve policy, a piece. So that was $2 million that you just kept in the back of your pocket. At the end of the day, you could have $15 million in the bank and it helps you a little bit, but you're still fighting risk. So I went to a conference, well, both Kim and I went to a conference and we learned about the evolution of insurance companies and how they're writing policies that help assume that risk instead of utilizing, a fund that is just there. Like, for example, the city's talking about a resiliency fund, which you would use that.
Exactly.
So I talked to a utility that was down in Florida prior to everything that had happened, and they did something similar after they got hit with a hurricane. And they used it on the utility side. They were electric utility, and
But they had it to use.
and it was $15 million, and it just sat there. They couldn't touch it. It just sat there. So it was solely
Establishing it
used.
is the issue though.
Yes, and it was solely used for the purpose of emergency.
Yes, exactly. That's the whole concept behind the resilience.
And now they're talking about the idea of parametric insurance, which is a whole new game where you essentially run scenarios similar to what you're doing here, almost like a Monte Carlo, but from, okay, Category 3 hurricane comes, you assume X amount of damage, and you actually set up what your funding would be. So let's just call it, you look at all your assets and you look at a 50% loss, call it $75 million, you come up with what your payout would be. And you're essentially funding the risks should that situation happen.
Huh.
It's a mind boggling. I've reached out to our insurance company to see what it would look like, because I can only assume that it would cost a lot of money.
You got that right. But the back end of it is good though.
Yes. So you come to this situation where you have a strategic plan to invest in assets that you own, but trying to thread the needle between at what point do you use cash? At what point do you fund? I mean,
At what point
like-
do you use the money they give you versus your own?
correct.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So can the extreme, the Category 4 storm be separated from the, I don't know, the regular ebb and flow of projects and funding?
That's kind of where you get into actually setting aside money that is specifically for that. So I'll use the example, our reserve policy. So this is the reserve account. So this says you got 6.5 million. The reserve policy, which then triggers your thought behind having these conversations, right? If you dip below it, you need to talk about pushing projects off, funding, or rate increases. That policy states there's 2 items in there. One of the items is self-insurance for both pollution and on the flood. So using this as an example, that policy says you need to hold this amount of money in there. So
And
right
leave it
now,
alone.
correct,
Absolutely.
yes. So now in this situation, you've dipped below that policy. So
Yeah.
now you're
See, there's
having,
your danger.
correct.
Yeah.
That is exactly, because it's all in one.
Yep.
It's not separated out.
Yep.
So by definition, what you just said, we don't have that separated, and that's part of the 6.5 million number
It's part of this,
at
dis-
the moment.
Yeah.
it's
Okay,
part of this
and therefore
discussion.
Yeah.
it's in the data and the information that's spread out there.
It's like leave that alone
Mhm.
and start working on this side.
Yeah.
And that's-
Personally,
And that's
that's
why.
how I'd approach it.
And that's why you sit here and you start talking about, okay, that policy took all these different aspects and put it into one. And
But
now
that's all
here-
you got.
correct.
Okay.
And now here we are trying to say, you've dipped below that.
Yeah.
And then
Okay.
starting to think about how you pull it apart so that you don't get this kind of dirty water situation where,
Yep.
Okay, so can you go to 7C?
Mhm.
This is a continuation. If you go to 2024 and the negative 600,000 at on line 9,
Mhm.
and we look now at how to separately fund that. Is that is that the right approach, Mike, of looking to funding sources for the red numbers all the way across number 9?
How about you
Look
don't
at-
get to the red numbers?
Select
No, I think,
right. To supplement the 6.5, which otherwise seems to carry you across. You need to add, but if you start thinking about adding it now in a policy, insurance, or funding from DMEC or whatever, is that where we are headed into that financial planning options?
So I would say Austin just added one more complicating feature. Another
Yeah.
complicating feature, which is that 6.5 million is not earmarked to plug all these holes. It's actually got a self-insurance component to it. That means by 2024, you would have no self-insurance left. You,
right, so
You're
you don't
done.
deal with, right. Right. That's, that negative figure is not your issue. It's recognizing that 6.5 is all you have. And start working on the other side of that and start thinking about what should we do as it relates to those scenarios that we're giving you.
and I'll use a prime example. So we sat down with the insurance company. The insurance company comes back and said, pollution insurance has now become much more affordable. $13,000 buys you 3 years of coverage.
Okay,
So at that point, you can fund yourself for 3 years. Instead of self-funding yourself for
Yep.
$1 million
Yep.
every year,
Yep.
you can pay
so
13,000 and you cover yourself. For
Yes.
that. But then flood is much different. Flood is like you're paying 50, 60.
well, that's well, your own personal home.
Correct.
What I know is
Yeah.
changing constantly, but that 13,000 is a hell of a lot better than that other insurance thing of $1 million.
And I think this leads into the discussions. We're trying to get a handle on kind of forecasting out, but then you have existing policies that I think are aging policies that need to be updated.
Yes.
And
yes.
that's the other piece
Yeah,
to
that's
it.
where you need to be thinking.
Yeah.
Definitely. This 628 is that, it's an issue, don't misunderstand me, but it's not your real issue.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah, because the way that the policy writes now, I mean, you can see the reserve policy has outlets in there for is it 25%?
25% O&M expenses, 2% historic book value
Depreciation.
of assets. 15% of the first year of the capital plan and 15% of 1 through 5. So the first year gets counted for 30%.
Yeah.
And then self-insurance, which is $2 million.
That's-
And customer deposits.
Oh yeah, customer deposits,
Yeah.
which actually really should be taken out of that number because we absolutely cannot touch that.
But that number is minimal. and
Yeah, yeah.
For apples to oranges here.
that's where you head up.
Correct,
Seriously.
correct. But that's one of those where you guys have to change policy.
Mhm.
We're trying to
Which
enlighten you.
guys?
Board.
The board.
Yeah. We operate on-
Really, I mean.
You're shedding light,
really,
you're
you're
peeling the layers of the onion back.
So
Yeah.
if based on this discussion about that line 9, it would appear very important to get at least the sewer in to see, okay, where are the red numbers at that point?
Right.
So that we have a better picture of what's the magnitude, how many more red numbers or how many fewer are there? Because we're only looking at 3/4 of the picture.
And at the same time, work on that other scenario.
Another interesting thing to
Which is
throw
your
out is
security
line
blanket.
number 7 on the 50th percentile, kind of the average case.
Mhm.
In 2024, it looks like all you'll have left is the self-insurance.
Mhm.
And that's on average. That's not even without a really negative extreme, event. You basically have a 50% chance of falling below
Mhm.
your self-insurance number. If Austin, if I heard you right, it's at 2 million.
Yeah, 1 million for pollution, 1 million for
That's
flood.
Yeah.
2 is as
So-
close as you get.
So really what we're saying is we have 6.5 million total and reserves. We are not accounting for what we actually need to hold. And using just that number, we're already showing
Yeah.
possibilities
Yeah.
of going
Yeah.
cash negative up
Yes,
to 30% by 10 years from now.
yes.
So something needs to be done.
Yep, that's the conversation
yeah.
we're having. That has to do with, that class you took?
Mhm.
Good class,
Mhm.
because it's telling you what you need to do as relates to getting your money over here to cover this.
Correct.
This becomes secondary to that.
And that includes borrowing that we know that we're gonna do for projects. So if that comes out, those numbers are gonna be even
Yeah,
higher.
see,
before we even put
you don't
sewer
even
in.
have that in this.
Yeah.
But security is the name. You got to go the other direction too.
And then again, this is just assuming current policy,
Yeah,
because that policy is what's existed and hasn't been.
And that's what we want
well, that's what you need
to
to be
make a
looking at.
recommendation to change or modify
Absolutely.
in various ways, because we have an evaluation carefully projected in good faith with good information going into it, best we have, and a consistent framework for forecasting what really is
Yep.
the picture. Now we're starting to get a sense of how we can start to shift that picture with what is driving.
Yeah, it's
certain
called look at your
things.
policy and start working on it immediately and getting it where you feel secure.
And this is a
And if
conversation.
your policy is outdated, then that's the first thing you ought to be going after.
And that policy was pushed down to the finance committee. That's the
You
piece.
gotta move that,
So you're having the discussion that nobody likes to have, but you have to
but you gotta
it.
have it.
It's 3 things. You either push projects, you go for funding,
You're right.
bonding, or you raise rates.
You
Those
got,
are your 3. That's per the existing policy.
yep. You know what you're doing. You know what you have to.
So, Mike, we're gonna add a sewer line, a sewer utility into the scenarios. And possibly an option for treatment plant. To see, what is the real, what's closer to a real picture that needs to be modified, addressed with the financial planning and leverage options, so that we can make some intelligent recommendations to the board.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
It does. And it feels like that would affect 7B.
Correct.
Your
Yeah.
7B, the scenario slide, and we can easily accommodate if Kim and Austin have a new set of thoughts around rates or other things.
Right.
And then we'll just kind of,
And I can also do a whole different, just save as a copy and then change this page that's running the simulations to take out that funding so you can actually see just our cash where we're standing, not accounting for what we already know that we need to borrow.
in fact, that's a great point, Kim. We could, I have to think a little bit about this, but we could probably easily modify this where we actually could get a sense for what the overall borrowing is.
Yeah.
Right now, what we're modeling is the incremental borrowing above, and as you all know, above and beyond borrowing already assumed, but it might actually be good to understand what that aggregate borrowing is. And you may find that unacceptable in a lot of these scenarios, which are some of these scenarios are going to really ramp up the amount of borrowing that the organization would have to take on. And there's always that possibility that in a really bad situation, the organization may find itself not able to borrow.
What we could do is we could add a line there, like each one, like best realistic one, realistic two, and worst for each one of the utilities, and add a number with what the assumed borrowing is to actually pull it.
Oh,
and
yeah,
extract
that'll
that
show you
number
what
out
you're,
so that you can see.
it'll give you reality.
So we're adding another column?
Well,
And
yeah,
that's easy.
Yeah,
That.
no, but I'm just,
Yeah.
the same chart, if you will, with an additional column that has that new information on it.
Yeah.
And the whole purpose is to find, in this situation, is to find where your shortfalls are, because we've never sat down and actually looked at how to invest each line item, each utility accordingly. It's all been invested the same, just like your self-insurance money has been invested the same. Everything that's in that reserve account, or what makes up that reserve account, has all been invested in one theory, one approach, instead of saying, well, like in this situation, water doesn't look nearly as bad as when you're looking at stormwater and or electric. And so the way you invest the monies associated with each one of those could have
And
variety.
Just to piggyback on that, for the city, I looked at their reserves and they have different accounts, like the transfer tax account and the reserve account and the eligible funds or whatever. Like they have their main amount that they tell you, this is how much you have in all of your accounts, but here's all of the 3 different accounts, I think it was, and what the investments are for those 3 different accounts.
Are they invest?
What'd
Each
you
one's
say?
invested
There's
differently.
5.
2 are invested differently, the remaining are invested.
Yeah, the answer is yes. You need that.
Are they legally separate accounts, meaning they can't be used for cross purposes?
For ours, for BPW.
Are you talking about
it's-
us? City?
Well, both of you actually, because I was going to make a comment depending on what the answer was.
Ours is, and I think the cities is too. Yeah, like we have impact fees that can only be associated, that are allocated in that reserve account, that are only associated with each one of the utilities. Meaning you can't rob Paul or pay Peter.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so if it's not just one pile of money that's organizationally organized to just fill in whatever holes, depending on what combinations of utility scenarios come out, that has a different implication and it's more complicating. If they're all like, well, only 1.8 million goes to water utility, 2.2 million goes to stormwater utility, so that's a more complicating. There's nothing wrong with thinking about, even if the cash is one pool for the organization that can be used any way the organization sees fit. There's no reason why you can't think about it at the individual utility level from an allocation perspective. But at the end of the day, it's really the portfolio at the organizational level that comes out of that matters. But if they're legally separated, that's a different thing.
So the restricted funds are they have to be used that specific way, but the unrestricted funds, we can steal from different pots to use it to pay for other
Beauty
utilities.
of unrestricted.
So in
Okay.
that portfolio, we have components of restricted and unrestricted.
Okay.
That's the UBS portfolio.
So, there's always a model's a very imperfect view of the world. It's just trying to give you some insights into a complex problem you're dealing with.
Right.
But we could, so there's always this thing, you don't want to complicate the model too much. It's trying to be a little bit of a simplified view of reality. But some of these things we're talking about here, like borrowing embedded in these revenue numbers of these scenarios, and restricted and unrestricted pools of cash for the different utilities, it might be worth complicating up our model a little bit, to try to understand, see if we can get some insights from that as well.
Yep.
I don't know, that's a thought. You guys can disagree if you want.
I think that shows the most accuracy.
Absolutely. I think having that column is a real column.
Kim, maybe when I'm there next week, if we have a little bit of time at the end, maybe we can just
Yep.
chat a little bit more about it.
Yeah, I can have all the cash balances that show what's restricted and unrestricted.
Okay. And to Austin's point, I'll just throw out, generally, if there's a market-based insurance possibility, it is probably more advantageous than self-insuring. They
Uh-huh.
should be able to do it cheaper.
Oh, yeah.
So it was good to hear that there might be some interesting things coming along.
Mhm. It's your security blanket. That's what it is.
Hey, just look at what Florence, it's $15 billion.
See what I'm talking? Oh, no. I mean, that, God
Billion.
forbid, but the point is,
Yeah.
you need it. And if your present thing needs to be updated, you better get, that would be the first priority. Bring that before your board and say, guess what, guys?
So Florida has $1 billion in their fund.
No.
No, they don't.
They're each one of the communities is different, but I'm just saying they have 15 billion in damage from this
Okay.
hurricane. But that's just putting it in perspective is that, when the lights go out, it's expected that the lights are going on, they're gonna come on, and they're coming on when you have somebody there and you're paying somebody to turn it on,
Mhm.
whether it be through the federal government or mutual aid.
It's coming. They
Yeah,
have to do that aspect.
I was wondering what the per person cost would be on the pile of money from that,
Well, that's not good.
adjusted to Lewis's population or our ratepayers population, to see what's the order of magnitude.
Given that there's nothing there, that's kind of odd.
yeah, I couldn't even.
I mean, you
imagine.
can't even begin to
I
imagine.
mean, if the same situation happened, you can go into the scenarios that your electric grid's wiped out, you go into houses are wiped out,
Yeah,
becomes inhabitable, your wastewater treatment plant, which we're having the ongoing discussions of, we're having a study of.
they're gone.
If you have, you're talking 18 feet storm surge.
You have
You're
nothing
in-
to work with.
No, I mean, the beach side doesn't exist, the beach
Yeah.
side's underwater.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely nothing to work with.
My
And
house
Austin,
is water.
to your point, we're talking a lot about the financial side of it because we're in a financial committee. But there might be a lot of things you can do on the operational side to reduce risk as well. We all wear seatbelts driving in a car, to reduce our risk of getting hurt in an accident that may occur. So, those are, I'm sure you're having those conversations anyway, but it'd be great to reduce the potential liability to start with.
Right.
You know,
Which our conversations that are happening in mitigation.
Mhm.
Yeah, mitigation, the GHD study, because it's looking at the options of not having the plan exist where it exists today. So it all plays into it.
yeah, in our little model here, you know, that could entail, let's say, the worst case scenario of each one of these drops from 20 down to 5%. Or maybe it stays at 20, but the numbers are a lot smaller in the worst case. The negative numbers are smaller in the worst case scenario because the extreme risks have been mitigated. That would have a powerful impact on these simulations. You know, we could probably figure it out. There's probably a corollary to, you know, some of these things you may be able to do may be equivalent to doubling the size of your cash reserve portfolio, you know, have the equivalent impact at the end. You know what I mean? It's sort of like the more risk you have and the worst outcomes can be, the larger that portfolio needs to be. But the smaller your likelihood of having a bad scenario and the less bad, even when it happens, it is, you know, you can have a much smaller portfolio.
And I use the example as when we were, because I had asked the question, knowing that it's been brought up in the past. I mean, when I first started, it was brought up when cash reserves were in a much different place, but we also weren't investing nearly as much as what we are now. Is that when you have $15 million in the bank, somebody's going to ask, why are my rates this high while maintaining 15 million for not-for-profit in the bank? And the response that I received was, it takes one event. And when people don't have power for a week, they'll want $15 million in the bank. That was the exact response I received.
Mhm. Mhm.
Well,
So
we're
you-
lucky
you
we
get
don't
that
have 15 million in the bank.
Yeah, you get,
We're not getting that complaint.
yeah.
Yeah.
But that criticism exists because if you sit here and you're
All
trying
we care
to chase
about is
that,
what you have.
if you're trying to chase that and say, yeah, you need to put that up to 15 million. And we're talking about the policy, and that policy may change where that number lies.
Mhm.
If you're taking the self-insurance piece out, it may come down. But if you're putting capital in, it may go up, because in theory, you're improving your capital budget. You're also in your operations. Nothing's becoming cheaper. But at the end of the day, if we move forward and we implement rates that in theory help fund the reserve account on top of relooking at impact fees, that criticism will come back. And that's where when the question that I asked is, how do you fight that criticism? And she goes, it will exist until you have an event. And she goes, when you have an event,
It's
people
like-
will realize the necessity of having that there.
It's not a surprise, you know. They
It's-
don't
it's
ever
same-
recognize what's.
Well, it's the same thing, because if it didn't exist prior, but if you go into the discussions of creating a resiliency fund, people are gonna ask why.
I know, but you know, the joke of the matter is because the monsoon's coming.
Yeah.
Yeah, period. It's coming.
Yeah.
It's just when, so you want to have something there.
Correct.
Maybe tell them it's 20 million and then say, oh, okay, I would back it down to 15.
I didn't necessarily remember this about.
Yeah. But I think when we have our next finance committee meeting, I think that's a discussion that we should dive into. It's that policy that exists today, that reserve policy.
You got that right. They have to have policy,
Mhm.
make it a reality
Mhm.
and a real policy. Because based on that, don't depend on that 65 that you have. It's a small, it's a lot of money, but it's a small part of your issue.
Mike, is there anything else to go over? And before segueing really into committee's next steps.
None for me.
I mean, we have discussed of adding in the sewer and another column and some insurance possibilities and re-looking at the framework to see whether there are more insights into what our presumptions have been. And make adjustments as may be warranted or a trial balance. And then you will still be available next week to sit with Kim and Austin?
It's already on the books.
It's on our calendars.
Good,
Yeah.
thank you.
I was having that oriented around the investment portfolio itself. But it sounds like if we have time, there might be some other things to talk about regards, some of the issues we talked about right now.
Reviewing your insurance bonds.
So scheduling the next meeting. Be sometime in November. I guess it's much dependent on how. What progress, new information, new evaluations we can glean from your the meeting next week.
So you're not gonna do that right now?
No,
Okay,
but just we shouldn't wait any longer than we need to, but we have some information and some
Mhm.
manipulations that we need to work on.
Okay.
Any other comments from anybody? I see that Mike is the only one on. Okay,
Richard, from my mind, I think we're all saying the same thing here, but we're going to try to add in something with the sewer utility. We're going to we may break out borrowing from the individual scenarios and put it in as more aggregate. If Kim and Austin are comfortable with that.
Yeah. So I have on my, my homework is to take out funding, borrowing scenarios, notes about what our policy is,
Mhm.
the amounts of money for each utility, what's, unrestricted and restricted, and the sewer utility.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And then we were also the insurance,
Mhm.
whether that might be available.
That's reviewing it. Review insurance.
Yeah,
policy. You
for
said
notes on
no.
policy, I assumed that would all fall in there.
Yeah. That's. You got it.
And Austin and Kim, is there what other levers do you have? I guess rates are a lever, charges to developers, things of that sort.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. So water impact fees haven't been touched since 2002. Sewer impact fees are a little bit more current, like 2015 to 2019, depending on the area that they reside. And then you have electric impact fees haven't been touched since the late 90s, early 2000s. That goes back to developers or new development. Then you start looking at all the existing fees like permitting, trench inspections, et cetera, which we're starting to kind of unfold that and dive into it. Rates, we're gonna look to probably have a cost of service done the fiscal year 23-24 is the plan, which would take into account, once we get the information about the wastewater treatment plant and the path forward that the board decides to make, that would be factored into that, because we're trying to get to a point where eliminate the unknowns, have someone that is a professional look into it, come back and give the recommendation back to us, looking holistically at everything. It's tough in the utility industry now because even on like power supply, it's like chasing a pipe dream.
You had also mentioned, I think our last meeting about the decision to take money from the government, which comes with potentially a lot of strings attached that raise the costs versus going to the market. Is that something where you think we're getting to a point to be able to look at that as well?
Yeah, when you're talking 10-15% increase, how that factors in over 20 years at a 2% or a 3% interest rate versus, and they're fixed terms. So it's not like you could pay it off in a shorter amount of time. I don't think a lot of people do, but if they're smaller projects at $1.5, $2 million, could you theoretically do a 10-year payoff instead of 20-year payoff? Take a higher term or take a higher rate at a shorter term. There's benefits to both, but it is, you're coming to a point, there's House bills that have been put up and that have been established and discussed on changing the way that bidding requirements are needed for state funded projects over 3 million, I believe 3 or 3.5 million, which adds a little bit of complexity too. So
depending on the outcome of that, will also affect our simulation results for our borrow rate.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it comes in two ways. It comes in with the cost of projects and it comes in through the borrowing rate. And so they're not grants, they're subsidized borrowing.
yeah, subsidized borrowing, there is the potential for grants. I'll just use the example that it's much harder for Lewes to receive a state funded grant or a federal when you're borrowing through WEAC, which is the Water Infrastructure Advisory Council, simply because the MHI for this area is much higher than other areas within the state. MHI being between $70,000 to $80,000 here versus you could go over in Seaford or the western part of the state where it's much lower, which provides because it ends up going into a ranking. That's how WEAC, you submit for an application or you submit for a loan, it goes into a project ranking. And one of the factors is MHI.
Which is median household income.
Yeah, so I'm throwing acronyms.
That's all right, I ask.
Yeah. It's tough. That's why when you do like individual projects, when you look at different communities, Donovan Smith, prime example, you do an MHI study on those and some other communities, it does provide
How much
an
did
avenue,
that be?
a path. Yeah.
Mhm. Now I get it.
But when you're doing, like, for example, a utility project, like I'm going to use the water tower, and actually I'll use Highland Acres. Highland Acres was a beautiful example of this, where there was a windfall that didn't necessarily have to do with MHI. There you had the Flint, Michigan issue, which had to do with lead, and there was a whole bunch of money that the federal government put out there for it. And we ended up taking the project timing was on point. There was over 500,000 in loan forgiveness. So the water loan was like 800 or 900,000, and nearly 60-70% of it was basically principal forgiveness at the end of the project. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that was Highland Heights.
Highland Acres.
I mean, Highland Acres.
Yeah.
Wow, wow, wow.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And there's a lot like in the most recent bills through ARPA, through the BIL.
Mhm.
There was a lot of language put in there without clarity on where the path forward was going to be. So we're still waiting on that piece too, because the electric is kind of like this unique piece. You can get grants through the state for stormwater, water, and sewer. Electric is a little bit different as an animal. You almost got to go through like the federal, the FEMA grants.
Oh, do you?
Yeah. Or you utilize, for example, like DMAC. So DMAC is a joint action agency. If we know bigger projects are coming down the line, we can utilize DMAC to help fund that. And they'll actually front, like the AMI, they used a line of credit to establish the entire cost of the project. And then once it was finalized, then they went out to the bond market, sought a bond to basically pay off the line of credit. And then the bond was assumed by the utility company.
Uh-huh.
Kim, I'm almost thinking, is some of that borrowing that you included in the scenarios, was that some of it assumed to be government borrowing?
Yes,
So it would have had both
Correct.
more expensive. Where the government borrowing happened, the cost would be more expensive. The rate would be lower, but the cost would be more expensive.
You have to
Correct.
pay for it.
so when I did like the debt service payments. For like best and worst case scenarios, I used a lower percentage for best case and higher percentage, obviously, for worst case. And the price of the project, best and worst case scenario of we're borrowing less money.
Mhm.
I'm almost thinking, this is probably not appropriate for this discussion at this point, but I'm just thinking out loud here that if we break out the borrowing.
Yeah.
You know where I have the one borrowing rate in that simulation?
Yep.
Yeah, but
I might be able to have two borrowing rates. One a government, one non-government, but we might be able to model it where when we turn to government, the cost of the project is more expensive.
Mhm.
I think we might be able to do that. I don't want to say simply, but it might be a feature that we can put in here since it's a real lever you guys have to think about. Did I lose you guys?
Nope, nope, we're here.
We're thinking.
Yeah. Okay.
Any other discussion, comments? Anybody object to adjournment?
Did you
Nope.
establish a meeting or are you waiting on that?
Waiting,
Wait.
Yeah, we're gonna do it later.
but November,
Fine.
sometime mid-November.
Okay.
perhaps.
All right, when I move the close.
Second,
Second.
all in favor?
Aye,
Aye.
thank you. Good stuff.
Thanks, Mike.
Good to see everybody. Have a great rest of your week.
You too.
Thank you, Mike.
Aye. Good to know.